The ballroom at the Beverly Hills Hotel glowed with soft gold light, the kind meant to flatter every face and soften every truth. Crystal chandeliers shimmered overhead, scattering reflections across polished tables where Hollywood's most recognizable names sat shoulder to shoulder. Laughter drifted like perfume, measured, practiced, strategic. In this room, nothing was accidental. Every smile had intent. Every pause had meaning. Dean Martin stood near the back of the hall, one hand casually tucked into his jacket pocket, the other resting around a glass he hadn't touched in minutes. He wasn't late. It was early enough to watch. Dean had learned long ago that arriving early allowed him to read a room before the room read him. He watched the way people leaned in when certain men spoke, the way laughter sharpened or softened depending on who told the joke. He noticed who commanded silence without asking for a hand, who demanded attention by force. Tonight, the silence belonged to Kirk Douglas. Kirk stood near the podium, tall, unmistakable, his presence as sharp as his famous chin. He didn't need to raise his voice. People leaned toward him naturally, as if gravity itself bent in his direction. Scripts and studios had taught him how to occupy space without apology. Dean observed him carefully. They were both stars, yes, but forged in very different fires. Dean Martin had come from steel mills and tenement streets, from nights when laughter was survival and music was escape. Kirk Douglas had climbed through grit too, but with fists clenched and jaw set, always fighting, always pushing forward. Their paths had crossed many times in Hollywood, sometimes warmly, sometimes not, but always with an unspoken tension neither man named aloud. Until tonight. The event itself was meant to be harmless. A charity gala honoring classic cinema, celebrating the golden age that had shaped them all. Speeches were expected. Stories were welcome. Gentle teasing was common. But cruelty, when dressed as humor, often received the loudest applause. Dean took a slow breath as the microphone squealed softly and Kirk stepped fully into the spotlight. The room quieted immediately. Forks paused mid-air. Conversations froze. Kirk smiled a practiced, confident smile. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady and commanding. "We're here tonight to honor excellence, to celebrate those who took this industry seriously, who treated acting not as a pastime, but as a craft." Dean felt something tighten in his chest, though he didn't yet know why. Kirk continued, pacing slightly. "Hollywood has always had room for many types. The method men, the dreamers, the fighters. A pause, and yes, even the entertainers." A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. Dean remained still. "Some of us," Kirk said, "spent our lives digging deep into characters, living them, suffering for them." He gestured lightly. "Others made careers out of charm, cocktails, and playing the same tune over and over." This time, the laughter was louder. Dean didn't flinch. He'd been called worse by harder men in darker places. Still, he felt the shift, the subtle turning of heads, the sideways glances, the unspoken question hanging in the air. Is he talking about Dean? Kirk's eyes scanned the room and landed, deliberately, where Dean stood. "Now don't get me wrong," Kirk said, smiling wider. "There's always a place for hacks who know how to sell a joke." The word landed like a slap. Hack. The room reacted instantly. Few people laughed too loudly. Others went quiet, suddenly uncomfortable. Some stared into their glasses, pretending not to notice. No one spoke up. No one ever did. Dean felt 100 eyes on him, weighing his response before he'd even made one. In Hollywood, silence could be defeat or dignity. The trick was knowing which. For a moment, Dean considered leaving. He could walk out, disappear into the warm California night, let the insult dissolve into gossip by morning. That would be easy. But easy had never been his path. He remembered his father's hands cracked, bleeding from factory work. He remembered nights singing in smoke-filled clubs where drunks threw glasses if they didn't like the song. He remembered being told, over and over, that he wasn't serious enough, wasn't talented enough, wasn't worth the spotlight he somehow kept stepping into. He had swallowed those insults then, but this was different. This was public. This was deliberate. This was meant to reduce him to define him in front of 100 people who would happily let the definition stick. Dean lifted his glass, took a single sip, and smiled. Not a defensive smile. Not a bitter one. A calm smile. He waited until Kirk finished his speech and the applause rose uneven, uncertain, but loud enough to give Kirk his moment. Then Dean moved. He didn't rush the stage. He didn't storm. He walked with the same relaxed confidence audiences had loved for decades. As if this were just another set, another night, another song waiting to be sung. A few people noticed him approaching the podium and gasped softly. Whispers spread like sparks. Is he really going to respond? Kirk saw him at the last second. For the briefest moment, so quick most missed it, Kirk's confidence flickered. Dean reached the microphone and gently adjusted it, lowering it slightly, as if preparing for a quiet conversation rather than a confrontation. The room fell silent again, but this silence was different. It was tense, expectant. Dean looked out at the crowd, not accusingly, not pleadingly, just honestly. You know, he said softly, his voice smooth, unhurried. I've been called a lot of things in my life. A few nervous chuckles followed. I've been called lucky, lazy, a joke. He paused, glancing briefly toward Kirk, not with anger, but with something closer to curiosity. And tonight, I learned a new one. The room held its breath. Dean continued. What I find interesting is how we measure worth in this business. He let the silence stretch. Some folks believe suffering makes art valuable, that if you didn't bleed enough, your work doesn't count. His voice remained calm, almost gentle. Others believe joy has no depth, that making people laugh or feel good for a few minutes is somehow less. Dean smiled again, this time sadly. I never thought my job was to impress critics, he said. I thought my job was to make people feel something. Sometimes that feeling is joy. Sometimes it's comfort. Sometimes it's just a break from a hard day. He paused, then added quietly, I don't think that makes me a hack. The room was utterly silent now. Dean turned slightly toward Kirk. But if it does, he said evenly, then I suppose I'll keep hacking away one smile at a time. He stepped back from the microphone. No dramatic flourish. No insult returned. No raised voice. Just truth, delivered with grace. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then applause began, slow at first, hesitant. One table. Then another. Then the entire room rose to its feet, the sound swelling until it filled every corner of the ballroom. Kirk Douglas remained standing at the podium, clapping as well, but his expression had changed. The sharp certainty was gone, replaced by something heavier. Regret. Dean returned to his place near the back, untouched glass still in hand. He didn't bask in the applause. A taint. He didn't smile for attention. He simply stood, breathing steadily, as if he had finally said something he'd carried for years. That night, people would talk. Some would say Dean had won. Others would say Kirk had gone too far. Most would argue about who mattered, more depth or charm, pain or pleasure. But Dean Martin knew something none of them did. The strongest response wasn't anger. It wasn't revenge. It was dignity. And this was only the beginning. Applause can be louder than insults, but it fades faster. By the time the ballroom doors closed behind the last guests, the echo of Dean Martin's words still hung in the air, heavier than the crystal chandeliers that had witnessed them. The gala staff moved quickly now, collecting glasses, folding chairs, erasing evidence that anything uncomfortable had ever happened. Hollywood was very good at erasing moments, especially the ones that revealed too much truth. Dean didn't stay for the after-party. He rarely did. Fame had taught him something simple. The loudest rooms were often the emptiest. So he slipped out through a side corridor, nodding politely to a young assistant who looked at him like she'd just seen history walk past. Outside, the night air was cool, honest. No applause, no judgment, just quiet. Dean lit a cigarette, but didn't inhale right away. His hand trembled just slightly. Not because of fear, not because of doubt. Because restraint costs something. Inside that ballroom, he'd held back decades of frustration. He'd chosen grace over fury, dignity over destruction. People called that strength. But strength, Dean knew, wasn't free. It left bruises no one applauded. Behind him, a door opened. Dean, the voice was unmistakable. Dean didn't turn around immediately. He took a slow drag, exhaled into the night, then finally faced Kirk Douglas. Up close, Kirk looked older than he had on stage. The spotlight had hidden the lines around his eyes, the tension in his jaw. Without the microphone, without the audience, he seemed human. "You left early," Kirk said. Dean shrugged lightly. "I do my best work off stage." An awkward silence stretched between them. No music, no laughter. Just two men who had spent their lives being watched, now alone with no script. Kirk cleared his throat. "You embarrassed me in there?" Dean met his gaze calmly. "No, I embarrassed your words." Kirk stiffened. "You think you're better than me?" Dean shook his head. "I think that's the wrong question." Kirk studied him, eyes sharp, defensive. "Then what's the right one?" Dean crushed the cigarette under his shoe. "Why did you need to say it?" That question landed harder than any insult. Kirk turned away, pacing a few steps, his hands clenched. "'Cause I'm tired," he said finally. "Tired of watching people confuse popularity with depth. Tired of seeing hard work reduced to charm." Dean's voice remained steady. "And you think charm is easy?" Kirk scoffed. "You walk on stage, smile, sing a song, tell a joke. People adore you without asking you to suffer." Dean stepped closer, now not aggressively, but deliberately. "You think I didn't suffer because I didn't show it the way you did?" Kirk didn't answer. Dean continued, quieter now. "You ever perform for a room full of men who might beat you if they daren't like your voice? You ever sing because it's the only thing keeping you from going back to a life you clawed your way out of?" Kirk's jaw tightened. "I learned early," Dean said, "that if I didn't make people laugh, they'd hurt me. If I didn't make them smile, I wouldn't eat. So yeah, make it look easy." That was the point. The silence deepened. Kirk exhaled slowly, rubbing his face. "You know what they said about me when I started?" Dean nodded. "They said you were too intense, too angry. They said I scared people," Kirk said bitterly. "That I'd never be loved the way other stars were. I had to fight for every role, every ounce of respect." Dean looked at him for a long moment. "So you decided love was less valuable than respect?" Kirk's eyes snapped up. "Isn't it?" Dean didn't answer right away. He looked past Kirk, toward the dark city beyond the hotel walls. "I've stood in hospital rooms," he said quietly, "singing to people who didn't know my name but knew my voice. I've seen men cry because a song reminded them of home. I've watched laughter keep someone alive for one more night." He turned back to Kirk. "Tell me, how do you measure that?" Kirk swallowed. A fight drained out of him slowly, replaced by something unfamiliar. Doubt. "I didn't mean to humiliate you," Kirk said at last. "I meant to be honest." Dean nodded. "Honesty without compassion is just cruelty in a nice suit." That hurt. Kirk looked down at his hands, the same hands that had portrayed warriors, survivors, legends. Hands that now felt strangely small. "You know," Kirk said quietly, "when they clap for you, it sounds different." Dean raised an eyebrow. Different how? Warmer, Kirk admitted. Like they're thanking you, not admiring you. Dean smiled faintly. There's nothing wrong with wanting admiration. Just don't punish others for choosing gratitude instead. Another silence. This one wasn't hostile. It was heavy with things unsaid for years. Kirk finally spoke. Why didn't you hit back harder? Dean shrugged again. Because if I did, I'd be playing your game. And what game is that? The one where pain wins. Kirk closed his eyes. For the first time that night, his voice cracked. I don't know how to be anything else. Dean studied him not as a rival, not as an enemy, but as a man trapped by the very armor that made him powerful. You don't have to know tonight, Dean said. Just don't tear others down to remind yourself you matter. Footsteps echoed from inside the building. Someone was looking for Kirk. Dean stepped back. This conversation doesn't leave this sidewalk, he added. Not because I'm afraid, but because some things are meant to change quietly. Kirk nodded slowly. Dean, he said, stopping him as he turned away. What you said in there, it didn't just put me in my place. Dean paused. It put me in front of myself. Dean didn't reply. He simply tipped his hat and walked into the night. Inside the hotel, Kirk stood alone. The applause from earlier replayed in his mind, but now it sounded different. Not like victory, like a verdict, and somewhere deep inside him. A question began to form, one that would haunt him far longer than any insult he'd ever thrown. What if the man he called a hack understood strength better than he ever had? Hollywood has a way of punishing silence. For days after the gala, the industry buzzed not loudly, not publicly, but in the subtle, poisonous way it always did. Phone calls ended a little too quickly. Invitations paused in mid-sentence. Names were dropped into conversations like bait, waiting to see who would flinch. No headlines appeared. No scandals broke. But everyone remembered. Dean Martin felt it in the pauses. In the way studio executives smiled without warmth. In the way comedians suddenly joked a little less freely around him. Unsure which version of Dean they were allowed to see, now the easygoing entertainer, or the man who had calmly dismantled a legend with nothing but truth. Dean noticed it all. He always did. He spent most afternoons alone now, sitting on the back patio of his home, the pool shimmering under the California sun. Music drifted softly from a radio inside old Italian songs his father used to hum when he thought no one was listening. Dean stared at the water, lost in memories he rarely allowed himself. Because once the mask slipped, it was hard to put back on. Across town, Kirk Douglas was unraveling. He had replayed that night in his mind more times than he could count. Dean's voice, steady, unarmed, devastating in its calm, had become a constant echo. Every compliment Kirk received now sounded hollow. Every nod of respect felt conditional. For the first time in decades, Kirk doubted the story he'd built about himself. And doubt, to a man like Kirk Douglas, was more terrifying than failure. The breaking point came at a studio screening. The room was packed with critics, producers, younger actors eager to be seen. Kirk sat in the front row, posture perfect, attention focused. But his mind wandered. When the lights came up, applause followed, polite, respectful, restrained. Then someone said it. He's brilliant, a young actor whispered nearby. But man, Dean Martin makes people feel something else. The words weren't meant to reach Kirk. They did. Kirk stood abruptly and left before the room could notice. That night, he drank alone, not recklessly, not publicly, quietly, the way men do when they're afraid of what might surface if they let themselves feel too much. He pulled open an old drawer and found a yellowed envelope, a letter he'd never mailed. Written years ago, in anger, in envy, in fear. It criticized the industry, the audiences, the stars who were loved without earning it. Stars like Dean Martin. Kirk crumpled the letter in his fist. Across the city, fate was preparing something neither man could avoid. The tribute, The studio had planned it long before the gala televised celebration of classic cinema. Honoring icons who had shaped generations, Dean Martin's name was on the list. So was Kirk Douglas's. Neither had been told the full program. The night of the broadcast arrived with surgical precision. Cameras, lights, a live audience. No room for editing, no chance to hide. Dean sat backstage, adjusting his cufflinks, his expression calm but distant. He hated tributes. They forced people to define you in ways you couldn't control. A young producer approached nervously. "Mr. Martin, there's been a slight change." Dean raised an eyebrow. "There always is." "We're, opening with a segment on your early life." Dean's hand froze. "My early life?" he asked softly. The producer nodded, already sweating. "Archival interviews, rare footage, some things the public hasn't seen." Dean felt a chill crawl up his spine. "Who approved this?" he asked. The producer hesitated. The board that told him everything. Someone wanted the mask gone. Dean considered walking out. He could. He had the power, the leverage, the legend. But then he thought of the people who had found strength in his music, of the kindness he'd defended, the truth he'd spoken to Kirk in the quiet of the night. Running now would make that truth look fragile. He nodded once. "Let's do it." On stage, Kirk sat in the front row. He hadn't known Dean would be featured first. When the lights dimmed and the screen flickered to life, Kirk leaned forward, uneasy. The footage began. Black and white images. Tenement buildings. Factory smokestacks. A narrator's voice, calm and respectful. Before the spotlight, the voice said, before the laughter, there was survival. Images of a young Dean Thin. Serious eyes, too old for his age, filled the screen. Stories followed. Dropping out of school. Working in steel mills. Nights singing in clubs where danger lingered in the air. Kirk felt his chest tighten. This wasn't the story he thought he knew. The narrator continued. He learned early that humor could diffuse violence. That music could soften cruelty. That kindness, in the right moment, could save a life. Then came the interview. An old recording. Dean's younger voice, unpolished, sincere. "I don't tell jokes because life is funny," the voice said. "I tell them because life can be hard. And sometimes people need a reason to keep going." The room was silent. Kirk's eyes burned. He remembered his own beginning, his rage, his drive, his refusal to bend. He had worn his pain like armor. Dean had turned his into a bridge. The segment ended. The lights came up slowly. The audience rose to its feet, applause thundering, not wild. Not frenzied, but deep. Earned, grateful. Dean walked onto the stage, the ovation washing over him. He didn't smile. He didn't bow. He simply stood, absorbing the moment with quiet humility. Kirk remained seated. Not out of pride, out of weight. For the first time, he understood. The applause that sounded warmer. The love that wasn't demanded, but given. As Dean spoke briefly, thanking the audience, Kirk felt something break open inside him. Years of bitterness, of comparison, of silent judgment cracked under the truth he could no longer deny. When the segment ended and the cameras cut to commercial, Kirk stood slowly, deliberately, and began to walk toward the stage. People noticed, whispers spread. "What is he doing?" Dean saw him approaching and stiffened slightly. Kirk stopped a few feet away. The lights were still on. The audience still watching. This was not private. This was reckoning. Kirk looked at Dean Martin, the man he had reduced to a word. Hack, his voice when he spoke, was low, unsteady. "I was wrong," Kirk said. The room froze. "I thought strength had to hurt," he continued. "I thought depth meant suffering in public. I thought kindness was weakness." He swallowed hard. "I was wrong." Dean said nothing. Kirk's eyes filled not with shame alone, but with relief. and I don't think I've ever been more wrong about anyone in my life." The audience held its breath. Dean stepped forward, not to accept praise, not to claim victory, but to close the distance. He placed a hand on Kirk's arm. "We all learn late," Dean said softly. "The trick is learning it all." Kirk nodded, tears finally spilling. And for the first time in decades, the man who had played heroes felt small, not humiliated, but humbled. Because the strongest moment of his life wasn't scripted. It was surrender. The applause that followed didn't explode. It didn't roar. It settled. Like rain sinking into dry ground, it soaked the room slowly, deeply until something long-starved finally began to breathe again. People weren't clapping for drama. They weren't clapping for nostalgia. They were clapping because they had just witnessed something Hollywood almost never allowed. A powerful man admitting the truth. Backstage, the air felt heavier than before. Dean Martin stepped away from the lights, his chest rising and falling a little faster than he liked. He had stood in front of millions, sung before kings and crowds, laughed with legends, but that moment with Kirk had shaken him in a way applause never could. Because forgiveness, when real, costs more than anger. He loosened his tie and sat alone on a folding chair, staring at the floor. The noise of the show continued behind the curtain, producers shouting cues. Assistants rushing past, but Dean felt detached from it all, as if he'd stepped into a quiet pocket of time meant only for reflection. Then came the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Dean didn't look up. "Kirk," he said softly. Kirk Douglas stopped a few feet away. "I didn't come to finish the show," Kirk said. "I came to finish the night." Dean finally raised his eyes. Kirk looked different. Not smaller in stature, but stripped of something rigid. His shoulders weren't squared for battle anymore. His face wasn't set in defiance. The armor was gone, and what remained was a man tired of carrying it. They stood there in silence, two legends backstage with no audience to impress. Kirk broke first. "I've spent my whole life standing," he said. "Standing my ground, standing taller, standing above." He swallowed. "I don't think I ever learned how to kneel." Dean frowned slightly. "Kneeling isn't weakness." Kirk let out a breath that sounded like it had been trapped for decades. "Know that now." Then slowly, carefully, with no performance in his movement, Kirk Douglas did something that would never make it into any official history book. He bent. Not dramatically, not theatrically. He lowered himself until one knee touched the floor in front of Dean Martin. Dean shot up instantly. "Kirk, don't." Kirk held up a hand. "Please, let me do this my way." Dean hesitated, then stopped. Kirk looked up at him, eyes wet but steady. "I called you a hack," he said quietly, "in front of people who mattered to both of us. I didn't just insult you. Why try to erase what you are?" His voice cracked. "And the truth is, I was jealous." The word hung in the air, naked and undeniable. "Not of your fame," Kirk continued, "of your peace. Of how people leaned toward you instead of bracing themselves. Of how you made kindness look like strength." Dean felt something tighten behind his eyes. "I spent my life proving I was tough enough to survive," Kirk said. "You spent yours proving people didn't have to be." A tear slipped free. "So I'm kneeling not to beg forgiveness, but to acknowledge something I should have honored a long time ago." He placed his hand flat against his chest. "You won." Dean stepped forward and gently took Kirk by the arm. "Get up," Dean said firmly. "You don't kneel to me." Kirk shook his head. "I kneel to the truth." Dean pulled harder, his voice rising not in anger, but emotion. "The truth doesn't want you on the floor." For a moment, they stayed like that, one man kneeling, the other refusing to stand above him. Then Kirk rose. As he did, something shifted between them, not rivalry, not hierarchy, but recognition. Two paths. Two kinds of strength. Both hard-earned. They sat together then, side by side, neither speaking for a while. Finally, Kirk laughed softly, a sound Dean had never heard from him before. It wasn't sharp or commanding. It was almost boyish. "You know," Kirk said, wiping his face, "I spent years thinking if I ever stopped fighting, I'd disappear." Dean smiled faintly. "Funny thing is, people don't remember how hard you fight. They turn toward each other. They remember how you made them feel." The show ended that night with tributes, music, standing ovations. But the real ending happened quietly. Weeks later, Kirk declined an award, publicly redirecting the honor to artists who taught us that humanity matters as much as talent. People were stunned. Critics debated it for months. Dean never commented. He didn't need to. Not long after, Kirk was seen sitting in the audience at one of Dean's performances, not backstage. Not in a private box, but among regular people. Laughing, applauding, listening. And when someone asked him why, he said simply, "I'm learning." Years later, when both men were spoken of in hushed, reverent tones, people remembered their films, their voices, their fame. But those who were there remembered something else. They remembered the night. A man who stood taller than most finally understood that humility was not the fall, it was the rise. And they remembered Dean Martin not for what he sang, or how he joked, but for the quiet strength it took to answer cruelty with grace, and to lift a kneeling man back onto his feet.